Chapter 8 of the Cloven Viscount deals a lot with the Huguenots. Their leader is Ezekiel, and his youngest son is Esau, and both of those two characters I think are important to the story. But really, before we go much further, it's important for you to know who and what the Huguenots are. Huguenots in general are French. They come from France, and they are religious extremists. They believe, as most religious extremists do, that they are good and everybody else is evil, that God loves them and God hates everybody else. And they also believe that they are very like everybody, all human beings are very sinful by nature, and that everything we think or do is evil, especially if we're doing anything that is enjoyment or happy or fun. So Huguenots think that what they should be doing is just working really hard all day, every day, or they should be worshiping God, and anything else that they do is just sinful. Now, when the Huguenots were in France, the Catholics sort of ruled the country, and the Catholics were very mean and cruel to them. They murdered them, they burnt them, they tortured them. That's why these Huguenots in this story are in Italy. They're finding a kind of refuge from that. But they've been affected by it, and they think this way. And so when they meet the good un, the good half of the Cloven Viscount, at first they think he's like them and they like him. But there's always this sort of distance because the Viscount, of course, is Catholic. But that's who these Huguenots are. Now, you have to remember, of course, that this is a fantasy story, and the good half of the Count is going around doing some very strange things, like he's tying rags around pomegranates, or he is tying up chickens outside the house of Prior Secco, or he's going to this old woman's house and setting snails in there. And for whatever weird, strange reasons, all of these things are signs for Dr. Trelawney, and what Dr. Trelawney is supposed to do is look at these weird signs, like rags tied around a pomegranate, and that's supposed to let him know that he needs to bring his pincers so he can pull somebody's tooth. Or he's supposed to see these chickens tied up outside this man's house, and that's supposed to be a sign that the man inside has diarrhea and needs a doctor. He does the same thing with the snails, and it's a sign that the woman inside has heart disease and he needs to be very careful when he goes in to help her. So the good half of the Viscount is doing all of these noble good things, and the doctor is helping him. And that's a real change in the doctor's care. Then we get another one of these dividers. These dividers means we're changing the focus of the story, and the focus of the story changes to the Huguenots. It talks about how the good un is going around and he's doing good for everybody. It says, no sheep broke a leg in a ravine, or no drunk drawing a knife in a tavern, or no adulterous wife hurrying home to her lover by night, but found him appearing as if dropped from the sky, black and thin and sweetly smiling, to help and advise, to prevent violence and sin. So he's going around doing good things, but he is also acting as if he is the conscience of other beings, of everybody else. He's telling you the moral and right thing to do. Have you ever seen one of those stories where you have a person who has a good angel on one shoulder and a bad angel on the other? That's a doppelganger story, just like this. The good half of the Viscount is the good angel, which means he's sort of the conscience of people. He's that thing inside you that tells you what the right thing to do is. Now, early in the chapter, one of the things that the good Viscount does is he goes around and he gets laundry from people who are sick or poor or crippled, and he brings the laundry back to Pamela, and he and Pamela does laundry for those people. It's a way he can give them care. While he's doing that, one day he's sitting and reading a book, You don't really need to know this, but it's a famous book by an Italian epic poetry writer. He writes these long poems in these 8-line stanzas called octaves. You don't really need to know that, but you should notice what's happening. Pamela is sitting there and it says she's delousing herself. That means she has lice and she's picking them out. That's actually really in character for her because she's kind of like an animal. She lives outside all the time. She's part of nature. It's just her and her duck and her goat, and they sort of do all these things together and they live in the outdoors. But anyway, one day while the good un is reading his book, the bad one, the evil half of the Viscount, shows up, and he's carrying a scythe, a sickle, a scythe. It's that tool that you use for harvesting wheat, but mostly the only time I see it is when Death is carrying it. If you've ever seen that image of Death with his cloak, he carries a scythe with him. And when the bad one shows up, he tries to kill the good one. Really all he does is cut his book in half, so he fails, and then he runs away. But there is it's the setup. We know that these two men are going to meet each other again, and that they're going to fight, and there's going to be conflict. But you should be noticing this story is an allegory. Right now, inside all of us, there is this fight. It's between good and evil. On a symbolic level, that's what this story is about. And this is the beginning of us seeing the good half and the bad half of Merdardo fighting each other. We get another one of these page breaks, and then the story goes to the Huguenots. And the Huguenots are watching the good count arrive. They live up on a hill, and when the good un starts coming up the hill, they can see him coming. He's riding in on a mule. Now, that's actually a biblical allusion. The bad one rides a horse, but the good one rides this mule. And the reason for that is when you have a man riding a mule, that makes him look a little bit like Jesus in some of the old Christian stories from the Bible. He's the good one, and the good one is coming. Now, religious extremists like the Huguenots, and actually a lot of Christians, believe that one day Jesus will come back. But when he comes back, it might be difficult to recognize him. So, what you have to do is, anytime you see somebody who's poor or in need of help or distressed, what you're supposed to do is pretend that that person might be Jesus, and you're supposed to help them. It's a good moral lesson to remember every time you see somebody who needs help. That might be Jesus, so we better help them. Not just because it might be Jesus, but because that's the moral thing to do. At first, when the good one shows up, everybody gets along pretty well. You got to remember that there's that whole the Viscount is Catholic and the Huguenots aren't thing. But when they start talking to each other, they realize that they're both pretty moral and they want to do the moral thing. And so they have a lot in common. One of the reasons that the good one is there is he realizes that the Huguenots have lots of rye. That's a grain that you use to make a special kind of bread. And the good one wants the Huguenots to give their bread away to the poor. Well, they don't want to do that. They would lose all that money that they would normally get for selling their grain, which they work very hard to produce. So this is the beginning of the conflict between the good one and the Huguenots. He's asking them to be more good than they really are, and it puts them in a pretty awkward situation. It happens again when the Viscount sees an old man working in the garden, and he says that the old man is at an age where he shouldn't be hoeing in the garden 10 hours a day. He should be resting and letting other people take care of them. Well, the other Huguenots don't like that very much either. They all know that they have to work, so if one old man doesn't have to work as much, the others have to work more. So that adds to the conflict between them. For me, The thing I like most about this chapter is Esau. He's a naughty little boy and doesn't always do what he says. He's the one that takes the fodder away from the mule and tries to sell it and lies about the fact that the mule ate all the fodder. He's a really good example of a little boy acting like a normal little boy, and yet in his own mind, because he's been affected by these other religious extremists, he thinks that he's evil and awful and sinful. Calvino knows better. He knows what real evil is. He knows this because he lived through World War II, and he has seen how truly evil and horrible human beings can be to one another.